Um, Thanks very much, Heather. Good afternoon, colleagues. Larry Flanagan, General Secretary, last time speaker. Um, my speech will last for 33 minutes and 33 seconds, so that Des Kenny can finally win the Glasgow delegation sweep as to how long the General Secretary's speech is. Bit of a challenge, Des, for my last speech, but I'll do my best. I'd like to start, colleagues, at this our first in-person event in 3 years with a repetition of a huge public vote of thanks to all of our members, all of Scotland's teachers, and a vote of appreciation for the heroic efforts that were made over the 2 years plus of the COVID pandemic. I was recently at an international summit of the teaching profession, and as the discussion was going on, I felt obliged to remind the gathering that whilst for most people in the room, being together physically was in a sense new, because most had been working from home, the actual school lockdown periods, challenging though they were relatively short, and that for most teachers, being physically at their workplace with all the attendant risks of COVID had actually been the norm over the last 2 years. And it had an impact on teacher well-being, teacher resilience, and teacher attitudes. And as we move into what is a COVID recovery period, I think we have to remind politicians and civil servants and local council administrations of that fact, that across the last 2.5 years, teachers, like other public sector workers, have delivered throughout the COVID pandemic, and frankly, in a post-COVID environment, then we all deserve better than is being offered. The business as usual attitude, which has developed very, very quickly amongst people who used to talk about building back better, is simply not acceptable, and we have to keep reminding others of the sacrifice and effort that teachers have persevered with over the last 2 years. 10 years ago, in my first AGM speech as General Secretary, colleagues, I referenced the economic crisis which had been visited upon the country at that time by the greed of an unregulated banking and finance sector, in which the public sector was being asked to pay for at that time through pay freezes, through pay restraint, attacks on pensions, which were very real a decade ago and continue to impact now, and cuts in living standards. And here we are again, 10 years later, with teachers and other public sector workers being asked to pay for a crisis not of our making. And yesterday we heard from Jim Halfpenny about the levels of obscene wealth being enjoyed by a privileged elite, whilst food bank queues continue to grow. And we have to really call that out, and I think Jim did it very well in his speech yesterday. This is not a poor country. There is not a lack of resource or finance across the UK. There is a lack of political will to make the decisions that reverse the balance of poverty and wealth in our societies. And trade unions should be to the forefront in demanding change from our politicians. There were no teachers appearing on the Sunday Times rich list a couple of weeks ago, but we should certainly be commenting on the wealth that was displayed in that particular publication. And I believe, as a trade union, we have a very simple answer to this question of being asked to pay again for a crisis, and that is simply no. You know, that we are not prepared to be the ones who make the sacrifices going forward. And I believe that as a union, We are in a strong place, indeed a stronger place than we were 10 years ago, to actually fight back. We have developed a union over the last decade. We have developed a very strong organising approach to how we operate, which is based on the premise of involving members in all of the activities of the union. So, yes, we do want to offer a gold-plated service when members need legal support and advice. And it was interesting to hear the discussion earlier this morning. But just to be clear, just because we offer insurance, we are not an insurance company. We are a combative trade union, prepared and able to take on the fights we are required to undertake. Value Education, Value Teachers was a successful campaign, colleagues, but it took nearly 2 years to raise membership engagement to the point where we knew we would win the strike ballot that we had set in motion. And more to the point, it took those 2 years and the activities of members, including the massive demonstration, to persuade John Swinney as Deputy First Minister that we would win the ballot, which is the only reason why the money appeared on the table at the 11th hours. Colleagues, it will not take 2 years again to build that state of strike readiness. We are starting from a much higher level of member engagement. We are better organised, we are stronger, and even just over the last day and this morning, listening to the elan and enthusiasm of speakers at the rostrum there, we are ready now for this 10% pay campaign, and we will be strike ready come the autumn. You weren't all at the incoming President's dinner last night for kindred guests. I thought Andreen was doing her presidential speech, and I thought I was going to have to tie her down to the chair. She was so enthusiastic about we're going to batter you. And Shirley Ann Somerville was sitting next to her. She'd go, I can't wait to get started on this pay campaign. And I just feel it in the hall here. You know, people are ready for this fight because you have made the sacrifices over the last 2 years. And we are not prepared to see the victory of Value Education, Value Teachers washed down the drain because other people are making the wrong decisions. So come the autumn, causeless Scottish Government, be on notice, we will be strike ready. Colleagues, I may not be on the platform at the rallies, but I can guarantee you I will be on the picket lines. So let's build that campaign and let's win another 10% that our members deserve. I've been asked over the last week or so, colleagues, by a number of journalists and media outlets to reflect on my decade as General Secretary. So before AGM, I took a look at my first General Secretary's report. Education Scotland had just been created, and I made the point that we had to be careful about the Education Scotland juggernaut. Perhaps turned out to be more of a dinky model, but you know, the threat was there. New qualifications were just being introduced a decade ago. I quoted at the time 1 in 10 pupils living in poverty, and shamefully a decade later we now have 1 in 4 pupils living in poverty. Ken Muir yesterday spoke to us about the need for educational agencies to be practitioner-facing. And it was good to hear Ken say that, and it's in his report, which is an influential report, because that's what we've been saying for the last 10 years. Trust teachers, give teachers power, and you will have a better education system than you have at the moment. I have a strong faith in the empowerment agenda as being the right agenda. In theory, it's signed up to by everyone from Scottish Government down to the smallest local authority. And yet we are meeting here in Dundee, where the council is imposing a faculty structure against the expressed wish of classroom practitioners. I'm not sure they could even spell empowerment if that's what they think it actually means in practice. And we have said, I know, and David Baxter is leading the campaign locally, we have said to the councillors, if you can demonstrate in a single school there is staff support for faculties, then we will not oppose it. But if you have an empowered school agenda, you cannot, and head teachers cannot tell staff, this is the change that's going to happen. Because saying that you have consulted people and then you just go ahead and do what you always wanted to do, that is top-down management and not an empowered system. So this fight in Dundee is about more than faculties. It's about the principle of empowerment. Are you serious about giving teachers more control, or are you just doing another paper exercise and really, ultimately, nothing will change? The empowerment agenda is about teacher agency and professional autonomy. It's clearly not an uncontested area in practice, because for teachers to be empowered, others have to give up power. And that does include Scottish Government, local authorities, the educational agencies, and even school management teams where collegiality is not the norm. And we need to rise to this challenge, colleagues. I know when empowerment was first talked about, and I wrote an article in the SEJ talking about teacher agency, I did get one angry email from a member who said, "Oh, not somebody else who's going to be telling us what to do." And I said, no, you're the teacher agency. It's not a teacher agency, it's your teacher agency. So I did get a reply going, "Oh, thank you for clarifying that." But it's instructive that was just the instinctive reaction. Oh, here's somebody else coming to tell me how to do my job. Colleagues, I read recently a book from Andy Hargreaves and Dennis Shirley called 5 Paths of Student Engagement. And it's worth a read. It references the challenges of the pandemic, but also highlights the importance of analysing what they describe in the book as an accidental, real-time social experiment in delivering education in different ways. And a key lesson, I believe, from that period, and all of you, I'm sure, will share this conclusion, is the absolutely critical role of the teacher and the teacher-pupil interaction to the nurturing of well-being among children and as the basis for all successful learning. And it may seem obvious to us as practitioners, but it's something for policymakers often far removed from school practice that needs to be constantly said and repeated. We need to have this change. We need to see teachers being trusted. We need to see empowerment being delivered. And when we talk here, and when we've just been discussing the 2020 campaign, so others might see that as an improvement in teachers' conditions, but actually it's an improvement in young people's learning environments. And it means that successful learning will be more easily achieved when teachers are being supported appropriately with the resources to deliver that interaction in the classroom, which is absolutely critical. I just mentioned a decade ago we had new qualifications being introduced. It has not been a progressive decade in terms of qualifications, and frankly, we are in a poorer position today with the upper school qualifications than we were 10 years ago. And I could stand here for an hour and explain how we've got here, but what has just happened over May and June is an even higher high-stakes exam system than we had when we had standard grade and intermediates. So more and more children are dependent upon that exam performance in terms of their next steps. And we actually have to move beyond that as we consider the next steps in terms of the Ken Muir report. Andy Harvey this morning used the phrase a 3-year treadmill. Well, that's what we have done to children in secondary schools. We just drive them through assessment after assessment after assessment, and most of these assessments only decide which is your next assessment target. So we need a significant reform. The pandemic demonstrated that pupils and parents trust teachers' judgment. When the exams didn't happen, lo and behold, teachers were able to accredit pupils in a much more positive way than the exam system, which was exposed as being essentially inequitable to begin with. Any system that is based upon algorithms and quotas in terms of progression is loaded against those who are on the thresholds, those who are from the poorer backgrounds, seeking, aspiring to qualifications. And we need to say, and I know Andrea is all over this, we need to say to Louise Hayward, the starting point for new qualifications is our experience of the pandemic, trust teachers' professional judgment in terms of pupil progression. I'm just keeping my eye on Des here to see whether I have to speed up or slow down. So he's not doing anything at the moment. He's not panicking at the moment, so I will continue. Colleagues, I mentioned at the book launch, or rather not the book launch, but let's do it again sometime. I mentioned how odd it was in editing the book to be reviewing the recent history of the EIS, and in particular the 1980s, when we were campaigning against Thatcher in a period that really shaped the union as a trade union, and to realise that much of what is a lived experience for me and for those of my vintage in the hall is literally, and I use that word correctly for once, is literally history for many of our members. Nearly 50% of our members are aged 40 or under. So, many of them didn't even exist in the 1980s when we were doing these campaigns. That's a great strength for the union in terms of going forward, that we have such a youthful membership. But, my 43 years longevity does also give a bit of perspective on where we were and where we are now. And I do want to make the point that there has been really strong progress in critical areas in terms of Scottish education over the last 40 years. There is today, for example, an absolute consensus about the need to tackle the impact of poverty in education, to promote equity and equality across our system. That's a critically important agenda for the kind of society we want Scotland to be. And the EIS helped shape that agenda over the last 10, 15 years, in particular through the work of Equalities Committee and through the campaigning work of the Institute. When I started teaching in 1979, schools didn't seek to tackle the impact of poverty. They actually organised around the attainment gap. We had children who went into remedial classes in S1 and stayed in those classes until they left in S4. They were hived off from the rest of the school population. In 1979, when I started teaching, the majority of boys in Scotland left school without any qualifications whatsoever, because the only qualification, other than some ScotVec modules, was the O grade. And the O grade was designed for the top 30% of pupils in a school. So these young people who had to stay on to 16 because of the school leaving age being raised in the 70s, were leaving school without qualifications. And I said in a recent article, my first fourth year class were S4 Voce, and we were out in the huts, and I had 23 kids, 19 boys and 4 girls, and every single one of them left school to go straight on to the dole queue. And nobody batted an eyelid, because they weren't the ones destined for university. Now, that situation today would be completely unacceptable. It was unacceptable then. But the fact that today there would be an outcry if that was to happen, I think shows some of the progress we have made in changing the agenda. And I despair when I hear politicians talk about a halcyon past that somehow we have fallen from. It didn't exist. And frankly, we need politicians to stop their constant bickering and to lend teachers their full support, and more specifically to ensure that teachers have the proper resource and conditions to deliver for our young people today, because that is the challenge that lies before us. I see Des is getting a bit worried, so I'm going to just speed up a little bit. Before I finish, I would like to, because I've been talking about schools, I do want to acknowledge the work done by our members in both FILA and ULA. We often concentrate on schools, but our education system needs to be genuinely comprehensive, and the work of our SGAs in terms of colleges and universities is based upon the exact same principles of equity, equality and professional agency, and it's critical to the complete comprehensive nature of Scottish education. And in particular, both have been involved in industrial action, but in particular, I want to acknowledge the fighting spirit of FILA, who have been forced to engage in strike action repeatedly in protection of the college sector and college members. And I think the main body does owe a certain debt to them, because their willingness to fight and their ability to win, I think, gave the general body confidence that we too could do the same. So a big thank you to FILA and ULA. I try to avoid colleagues being sucked into the party political Punch and Judy show, which is the norm in Scotland. We're a constructive union. We'll speak to all parties and all levels of government, and obviously we've been speaking to the SNP-led Scottish Government for a considerable period of time. I do, however, want to call out what I regard as a singular failure of the SNP government, and that is in the area of Pre-5. I think shamefully the government has facilitated the marginalisation of nursery teachers in our Pre-5 sector, despite all of the research evidence that points to the efficacy of that role. And it just seems to me more sensible to prevent an attainment gap developing rather than engaging in a Sisyphus-like struggle to close that. I did say I'm going to get that wrong, and sure enough I did. Anyway, you know the guy that rolled the pebble up the mountain. So, you know, it has been a failure. We have fewer nursery teachers now, when actually the need for nursery teachers is greater than ever. And if we had nursery teachers engaging with pupils on the floors of nurseries, those young people from poorer backgrounds would be starting formal schooling in a much better place, and the attainment gap would not be as wide as it is today. Colleagues, I could spend a lot of time talking about all of the challenges we face, you know, ASN in particular, assessment, well-being, workload. But frankly, the motions that are being debated here at the conference are covering all of these items and covering them well. So I won't go into every single area, but I think we are creating a really positive set of actions going forward from our debates. I do, just before I finish with some personal comments, I do want to just make one slightly aside reference, and that's to an area of work that you often, you know, as members in schools might not always pick up on, but one of the things as General Secretary is I do get to engage at some level in terms of international work. As most of you will know, I'm European President of ATUS, and I'll be continuing with that role. And I don't think you can underestimate the importance of the solidarity work that the union engages in. It's often just an article in the SEJ or on the website we're putting out messages of support. But I have recently been in the frontline states in terms of Ukraine, where the trade unions there have been receiving the refugees, and our £50,000 donation has been given to trade unions in Poland, in Moldova, in Romania, and it's helping in a very practical sense to support the displaced people from Ukraine because of the war. I've had the privilege of speaking with the General Secretary of the Ukrainian Teachers Union, and they are continuing to provide online learning for children in Ukraine and those who have had to leave the country. And at all of these meetings, they thank us for the solidarity that we extend to them. And it's, I made a mistake of looking at Nicola there, right? So I'm going to look at Des because I can suffer him a bit better. The solidarity work that we undertake is truly critical to those who are facing really difficult circumstances. And if you're looking for a lunchtime fringe, Kevin Courtney from the NEU is speaking at the International Fringe, and Kevin and I are just back from a visit to Colombia. We were part of the Observer Group in terms of the elections there. But again, I don't want to, spoiler alert, I don't want to take anything away from Kevin's speech, but every single time we met with people on the wrong end of the injustice in that country, they thanked us for paying attention and making sure that their government knew the world was watching. So it's really, really important, and I hope that going forward in my new presidential role, I've gone from having 60,000 members to having 11 million. So I hope to continue close collaboration with Andrea in continuing that international solidarity work. So I have in my notes here, I'm going to finish with a few personal reflections, and I'm going to try to do so without becoming too emotional. So you can see already, you can see already I might have some difficulty with this. Tricia and I recently became grandparents, and I swear it's affected my hormones. I've actually started greeting at Gogglebox, so I'll see what I can do. It's been a great privilege, colleagues, to be General Secretary of the EIS for the last 10 years. I have been an active trade unionist all of my working life, and actually for the past 10 years, you've paid me very handsomely for doing what I used to do in my spare time, and used to do at weekends. So, to be honest, colleagues, it's been a blast. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I believe the Institute is in rude health. When I took over, our membership had dipped, and we were dropping a little bit. We now stand at over 61,000 members, and we have the highest rep density we have ever had. And I mention the rep density because school rep is where I began my own EIS journey. It's absolutely critical in terms of the interaction of members with the union. The school rep is the person who is the linchpin in terms of that interaction, and do want to acknowledge the debt we owe for the altruistic service we receive from our reps, and we have to make sure that we continue to support them in every way that we possibly can. I do hope to have a more informal occasion where I can speak to EIS staff, but I do wish to publicly thank all of the EIS staff who service this great institution. They are committed and professional in all their endeavours, and also, as I discovered surprisingly during lockdown, a source of great comradeship and friendship. I'd also like to thank my wife Tricia, who has just retired herself after 41 and a half years in the NHS. Tricia doesn't come to Tricia doesn't come to too many EIS events because she says I'm always wandering away talking to people and I just leave her. So I think she's only here today to make sure I'm actually going and she can book that holiday that we've been talking about. I'd particularly like to offer my congratulations to Andrea. She'll be an absolutely brilliant General Secretary and I look forward to seeing how she takes the union forward. With a lot less grumpiness, I suspect, than the current fella, but I think it's a wonderful choice and it will be exciting times for the union under Andrea's leadership. Just to finish, colleagues, I was asked to provide a General Secretary comment for the last edition of our student bulletin. So as I was writing the comment, I congratulated the students on completing their courses and welcomed them to the profession. I made the point that as teachers they would touch upon, for the better, the lives of thousands and thousands of young people. And they will, and colleagues, all of you have. Teaching is a noble profession and we should all be proud of our career choice. And despite all the challenges which are being enunciated from the rostrum, I would make the same choice again. I've enjoyed being General Secretary. Honestly, I haven't enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed being a teacher. I actually love teaching. I'm still GTCS registered, so if anybody's looking for a supply English teacher, you can give me a wee call. And my last point, colleagues, I'm really pleased to be stepping aside at an in-person AGM. I believe the convocation of the EIS is what makes life as an activist so rewarding. I hope you enjoy the same experience going forward. Thank you for all of your support over the past decade, colleagues, and here's to the next 10% victory. Thanks.